Police officer has been charged with the kidnapping and murder of a 33-year-old woman.
Goodwin leading the investigation into the disappearance of Sarah Everard.
I can just remember suddenly one of our detective sergeants came running over and said, "You need to come and have a look at this."
She texted her boyfriend to say she was on her way. She wore bright clothing. She walked on well-lit streets. She phoned him as she walked and stayed on the call. She chose the busier route. She did, by every measure that women are told to use, everything right. A serving Metropolitan Police officer drove past her on Clapham High Street at 9:28 p.m. on the 3rd of March 2021, stopped his car, produced his warrant card and his handcuffs, and arrested her for a COVID-19 rule violation she had not committed. Two witnesses saw him handcuff her on the street. They thought he was a plainclothes officer making a legitimate arrest. They thought she was in safe hands. Her name was Sarah Everard. She was 33 years old, and she was walking home from a friend's house in Clapham, South London, a journey of roughly 50 minutes. Her body was found 9 days later, over 50 miles away in Woodland in Kent. The man who killed her was still a serving officer of the Metropolitan Police on the night he did it. The question this case asks, the question it has never fully answered, is how and why. Sarah Everard grew up in York. She studied geography at the University of Durham, graduated in 2009, and built a career in marketing in London. By 2021, she was a senior marketing executive, living in Brixton with her boyfriend, Josh Stokes. She had spent more than a decade in London, the kind of decade that makes a city feel like home, where you build habits and friendships and routes you know by heart. Her friends and colleagues described her in the way that people describe someone who genuinely made the people around her feel steady. She was thoughtful, warm, and funny in a quiet way. She had recently become an aunt. She had plans. The ordinary, specific plans of a 33-year-old woman with her life ahead of her. Her sister's forthcoming wedding, a holiday, a move. The evening of March 3rd was a Tuesday. She had been visiting a friend in Clapham. She left at 9:30, later than she had intended, and she called Josh as she walked. The route she chose was well used and well lit, the kind of route that women walking alone at night are told to choose. He later told investigators her voice had been bright and breezy. The call lasted 17 minutes. At some point after it ended, Wayne Couzens stopped his car. Wayne Couzens was 48 years old. He had joined the Metropolitan Police in 2018, having previously served with the Civil Nuclear Constabulary in Kent, a specialist armed policing unit responsible for nuclear sites. By March 2021, he was serving in the Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Command, one of the most trusted and visible roles in the force, responsible for guarding the Houses of Parliament and foreign embassies. He had worked an overnight shift at the United States Embassy on March 2nd, the night before he killed Sarah Everard. He was authorized to carry a firearm. The people who knew Couzens from his time in Kent described him as someone who existed on the margins of the groups he moved through, present, unremarkable, not someone who stood out in either direction. He had a wife and 2 children. He lived in a rural area of Kent, not far from where Sarah's body was eventually found. He was not flashy or aggressive. He was, in his professional context, the kind of man that institutional environments often accommodate without scrutiny, reliable, quiet, compliant enough that nobody looked closely. A Channel 5 documentary later reported that colleagues had given Couzens the nickname the Rapist, a nickname that, if reported accurately, suggests that some of the people around him had intuited something they had not formally raised. The Metropolitan Police investigated those reports, and their findings were contested. What his colleagues did not know, or investigators would later establish, what some of them did know and had not properly reported, was that there were already documented concerns about his behavior. In 2015, while serving with the Civil Nuclear Constabulary, a complaint of indecent exposure was made against Couzens. The details of how that complaint was handled, whether it was logged, investigated, and what happened to the paperwork, would later become one of the central questions of the official inquiry into his case. He was, regardless of what happened to that complaint, subsequently hired by the Metropolitan Police in 2018. The complaint from 2015 did not prevent his application from succeeding. Then, in November 2020, he exposed himself to a female cyclist in a woodland area in Kent. Then, on 2 occasions in February 2021, the weeks immediately before Sarah Everard's murder, he exposed himself to staff at a fast food drive-thru. Those 2 February incidents occurred while he was on duty. A complaint was made after the second one. 5 days after that complaint was filed, Wayne Couzens kidnapped Sarah Everard. The prosecutor at the Old Bailey described what Couzens did as spending the entire evening of March 3rd, hunting a lone female to kidnap and rape. He drove around South London in a hire car. CCTV footage, later recovered by investigators, showed him driving past Clapham Common multiple times. Sarah Everard was not his first potential target that night. 2 women he encountered earlier saw his car and walked away. Investigators believe he had positioned himself deliberately, circling the area, waiting for someone who was alone. When he encountered Sarah, he stopped his vehicle, approached her on foot, showed his warrant card and his handcuffs, and told her she was being arrested under coronavirus lockdown regulations. 2 witnesses observed the interaction from a distance and saw him handcuff her. They described a woman who appeared compliant, her head down, being placed into a vehicle by what they assumed was a plainclothes officer. They did nothing, because there was nothing in the interaction, as they could see it, that required them to do anything. A police officer was doing his job. That is precisely what Couzens intended them to think. The use of his warrant card and handcuffs to conduct a false arrest is the element of this crime that the sentencing judge, Lord Justice Fulford, identified as the vital factor that made it the most serious possible category of murder. A serving officer, using the powers of the state, exploited the trust that the public places in law enforcement to abduct a woman who had no lawful reason to comply with his demands and every reason to believe that complying would keep her safe. This is the detail that made the case feel different to millions of people who read about it.
In Britain, a London police officer has been sentenced to life in prison for the kidnap, rape and murder of a young woman.
The advice given to women about how to stay safe always includes a version of, if you are concerned, flag down a police officer. Find someone in authority. Stay near other people. The assumption embedded in that advice is that official authority is, at minimum, safer than no authority at all. Couzens had studied and exploited that assumption. He knew what his warrant card meant to a woman who saw it. He knew what his handcuffs meant. He knew that the institution behind him, its uniforms, its badge, its history of being the thing you run toward when something goes wrong, would do his work for him. The institution that Sarah Everard had trusted to protect her was, in that moment, the instrument of her death. Sarah was reported missing on March 4th. The Metropolitan Police opened a major investigation immediately. Footage from streets across South London was gathered and analyzed. The last sighting of Sarah, the footage of her being handcuffed, was identified within days. The hire car Couzens had used was traced. Investigators connected the registration to a hire company, which connected it to Couzens. On March 9th, 6 days after Sarah disappeared, officers arrived at Couzens' home in Deal, Kent. He was arrested initially on suspicion of kidnapping. The day of his arrest, Couzens' factory reset his mobile phone 35 minutes before officers questioned him at the property. It is a detail that illustrates the same institutional knowledge that made the false arrest work. He understood what evidence mattered and what needed to disappear before it could be found. A subsequent Channel 5 documentary alleged that he may have been tipped off to the impending arrest by a fellow officer, though this was not established as fact in court proceedings. What investigators did establish was that his phone had been deliberately wiped and that the digital evidence it might have contained was gone. Sarah's remains were found on March 10th in woodland near Ashford in Kent. She had been burned. She had been placed inside large builder's bags and disposed of in a pond in dense woodland. Couzens was charged with kidnapping and murder on March 11th. He was held on remand. He offered no comment in the interview. In July 2021, he pleaded guilty to all charges. Before we get to the part of this case that changed how Britain talked about its police, I want to take 5 seconds. A case about what happens when the institution that is supposed to protect people becomes the threat is exactly what this channel is here to cover. Subscribing helps. 2 seconds. Now. The complaint from 2015. The 2015 complaint of indecent exposure against Couzens, made when he was serving with the Civil Nuclear Constabulary, was looked at carefully once he was arrested. What investigators found, and what the subsequent Independent Office for Police Conduct inquiry examined, was a pattern of institutional inadequacy. The 2015 complaint had not been properly pursued. It had not generated the kind of formal record that would have been flagged when the Metropolitan Police vetted Couzens' 2018 application. It fell through a gap between two separate police organizations and their respective recording systems. He was hired by the Met in 2018 with an open, uninvestigated indecent exposure complaint in his recent history. 2 officers from Kent Police and 2 from the Met were subsequently referred to misconduct proceedings over their handling of the indecent exposure reports. Here is the question this case forces into the open. Wayne Couzens was a singular person, one individual who committed an act of extreme violence, but he was also a police officer who had a documented history of indecent exposure, who had been accused of it in 2015, who had exposed himself again in November 2020 and twice more in February 2021, including while on duty, and who remained a serving Metropolitan Police officer with access to a warrant card, handcuffs, and the presumptive authority of the state, right up until the night he used all of those things to kill Sarah Everard. The question is not only who Wayne Couzens was. The question is how the Metropolitan Police kept Wayne Couzens. The Baroness Casey Review, a major independent review of the Metropolitan Police commissioned in the aftermath of this case and completed in March 2023, was damning. It found the force to be, in its exact words, institutionally corrupt, misogynist, and racist. Not the description of one bad officer, the description of an institution. The review found systematic failures in vetting, in professional standards, in the handling of complaints about serving officers, and in the culture that allowed those failures to persist. It found, in specific terms, that women inside the Met were routinely subject to discrimination and harassment from their own colleagues, and that multiple officers who behaved in ways that should have triggered disciplinary action had instead remained in post. It found that the processes designed to catch and remove officers like Couzens were not working, not because the rules did not exist, but because the culture of the institution had made their rigorous application optional rather than mandatory. The review was the most critical independent assessment of the Metropolitan Police in modern times. Commissioner Dame Cressida Dick had resigned in February 2022, citing the government's lack of confidence in her ability to reform the force. The Baroness Casey Review suggested the problems ran considerably deeper than any individual commissioner. There was also David Carrick. In January 2023, 16 months after Couzens' sentencing, a serving Metropolitan Police officer named David Carrick pleaded guilty to 49 offenses, including 24 counts of rape, committed against 12 women across an 18-year period. Like Couzens, Carrick had been the subject of complaints during his police career that had not resulted in action. Like Couzens, he had remained a serving officer. Like Couzens, he had used his professional identity, his warrant card, his uniform, the authority of his position as a tool in his offending. The Carrick case, arriving less than 2 years after Couzens, was not a coincidence. It was the confirmation that systemic failure was not an exception. It was the rule. September 30th, 2021. The Old Bailey, London. Lord Justice Fulford sentenced Wayne Couzens to a whole life order, life imprisonment with no minimum term, no possibility of parole, no prospect of release. In England and Wales, this is the most severe sentence available. At the time of sentencing, there were approximately 60 whole-life prisoners in the country out of nearly 7,000 serving life terms. It is reserved for the worst offenders, for crimes that Parliament and the courts have decided should never be the occasion for release. Fulford's reasoning was explicit. Couzens' use of his position as a police officer to detain Sarah Everard was the vital factor in the determination. The abuse of state power was not incidental to the crime. It was the mechanism of it. Sarah Everard's mother, Susan, read a victim impact statement in court. She said, "I go through the terrible sequence of events. I wonder when she realized she was in mortal danger." Her father, Jeremy, said Sarah had been treated as if she was nothing. Those statements, read in an Old Bailey courtroom, were heard in silence, but the public response had begun long before the sentencing. On March 13, 2021, 10 days after Sarah disappeared, 3 days after her remains were found, vigils were held across Britain. The Clapham Common Vigil, near where she had been taken, drew hundreds of women who came with candles and flowers to stand in the dark together. The Metropolitan Police, citing COVID-19 regulations, moved to disperse the gathering. Officers arrived in numbers. Women were handcuffed. Women were pinned to the ground. The Metropolitan Police physically restrained women who had gathered to mourn a woman killed by a Metropolitan Police officer. The footage was broadcast around the world. The political and public reaction was immediate and severe. Home Secretary Priti Patel described the scenes as upsetting. Mayor of London Sadiq Khan said he was angry and saddened. The Met's commissioner said she was heartbroken. None of those words addressed what the images showed. Baroness Jenny Jones, a Green Party peer, called in Parliament for a 6 o'clock curfew for men. She later said she made the remark to demonstrate how impossible it would sound, compared to the restrictions on movement that women absorb as routine. Nobody legislated a curfew for men, but the comparison landed. The vigil eventually dispersed. The footage from it did not go away. At the beginning of this video, I said Sarah Everard did everything right. She chose the well-lit route. She stayed on the phone. She wore bright clothes. She texted Josh to say she was on her way. Every piece of advice that women are given about how to stay safe, she followed it. And the thing that killed her was not a failure to follow advice. It was an institution that kept a man with a documented history of sexual misconduct, handed him a warrant card and a pair of handcuffs, and sent him out into the city where Sarah Everard was walking home. That is not the same as saying what happened to Sarah Everard was inevitable. It is saying that the conditions for it were created and maintained by institutional failure, by the gaps between Kent Police and the Metropolitan Police that allowed a 2015 complaint to disappear, by the vetting process that did not catch it, by the culture that the Baroness Casey Review described in 2023 as institutionally corrupt and misogynist, and by the 2 February 2021 indecent exposure complaints that were in the system. When Couzens drove around Clapham on the night of March 3rd looking for a woman to abduct. The Metropolitan Police has undergone changes in leadership and stated commitments to reform in the years since. Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley, who replaced Cressida Dick, has described the task of rebuilding public trust, particularly among women, as the defining challenge of his tenure. The Baroness Casey Review recommended a fundamental restructuring of how the force vets, monitors, and disciplines its officers. Whether those recommendations have been implemented fully, partially, or inadequately is a question that independent oversight bodies continue to monitor. Sarah Everard's family has said they want her remembered for who she was, not only for how she died. Her friends describe a woman who was generous and kind, and who was good at her work, and who loved the people in her life without complication. She was 33 years old. She was walking 50 minutes home from a friend's house on a Tuesday night in March. She did everything right, and the conversation her case opened about what women are owed in terms of safety, and what institutions owe the people they are supposed to protect, and what it means when those institutions fail, is the conversation that her family has asked to be her legacy. It is, at least, one that Britain has not been able to stop having. Wayne Couzens is serving a whole life sentence at a Category A prison. He will never be released. In March 2023, he received an additional 19 months for the indecent exposure offenses committed before the murder, time that is concurrent with the whole life order, and therefore changes nothing about his eventual fate. David Carrick is also serving a whole life sentence. The Metropolitan Police remains under an improvement program monitored by His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary. In March 2024, the BBC broadcast a documentary on the case, Sarah Everard, The Search for Justice, made with the consent of the Everard family, featuring previously unreleased photographs of Sarah and the lead investigating officer, speaking publicly for the first time. The Everard family have maintained, throughout everything, that they want the conversation. Her case began to continue and to produce change. If cases like this one, where the institution and the individual both carry accountability, are what you want this channel to keep covering, subscribe. Sarah Everard's name deserves to be said, and so does what her case made visible about the world she was walking through.